Ether Design Studios, housed in a soaring glass tower, was a temple to modern architecture. Its open-plan offices, sleek chrome accents, and floor-to-ceiling digital displays projected an image of cutting-edge innovation. At its heart was Julian Thorne, Ether's latest acquisition and a rising star. Julian, with his impeccably tailored suits and a portfolio brimming with awards, was presenting his concept for the Apex, a revolutionary skyscraper destined to redefine the city skyline. His voice, amplified by the studio's acoustics, vibrated with self-assured brilliance as he dismissed older design philosophies as relics of a less enlightened age and traditional drafting techniques as quaint anachronisms. He reveled in the gasps of admiration from junior architects, many fresh out of school, who hung on his every word. Unseen, yet ever-present, was Elias Vance, the building superintendent, in his faded work overalls. Pushing a cart of cleaning supplies, Elias moved through the studio like a ghost. He knew the building intimately. Every hum of the HVAC, every creak of the floorboards, every stubborn stain on the polished concrete. He was a silent sentinel, meticulously ensuring the temple of design remained pristine. On this particular afternoon, Elias was polishing Julian's expansive desk, his eyes quietly scanning the detailed 3D model of the Apex. He paused, an almost imperceptible furrow in his brow, his gaze lingering on a critical support beam. He saw a subtle, almost invisible tension point in the load distribution that Julian's advanced simulations, for all their complexity, seemed to have overlooked. But Elias said nothing, simply returning to his task. Julian, catching a glimpse of Elias lingering near his desk, scoffed. "Some people," he announced to his captivated audience, his voice dripping with condescension, "only understand the physical reality of cleaning up after others' creations, not the intellectual rigor of bringing those creations to life." A ripple of nervous laughter went through the younger architects. Anya Sharma, seated at the back, felt a prickle of discomfort. She'd observed Julian's tendency to belittle staff members beneath his pay grade, but this explicit dismissal of a fellow human being based on their profession chafed her. Elias, however, merely straightened, offered a slight, almost imperceptible nod, and pushed his cart away, his quiet dignity a stark contrast to Julian's brashness. He moved towards the recycling bins, his thoughts elsewhere, remembering a different design, a different tower, and a mistake that had cost him everything. He had learned long ago that some truths were too dangerous to voice. Weeks later, the initial euphoria surrounding Julian Thorne's Apex design began to wane. A critical design review revealed a significant structural instability in a key cantilevered section, a complex aesthetic flourish that defied conventional engineering solutions. The firm's structural engineers were baffled, struggling to find a way to make Julian's ambitious vision feasible without compromising safety or aesthetic integrity. The project and Julian's reputation hung in the balance. Tensions ran high. Late nights became the norm, fueled by caffeine and growing frustration. Julian, typically unflappable, was visibly stressed, his usual swagger replaced by a tight-lipped anxiety. One evening, as most of the design team had left, Julian was pacing around the large communal table, cluttered with blueprints and frustrated sketches. Elias Vance, on his nightly rounds, entered the studio. He paused, his gaze drawn to the problem section on a blueprint displayed on a light table. He instinctively reached for a discarded drafting pencil, his fingers flexing as if to instinctively trace a solution. Julian, frustrated and desperate for a target for his mounting pressure, spun around and saw Elias. "What do you think you're doing, old man?" Julian snapped, his voice sharp. "Planning your next mock trajectory? This is advanced architectural design, not a playground for busybodies." Elias calmly returned the pencil to the table. "Just observing, Mr. Thorne," he replied, his voice soft, almost a murmur. "The cantilever has an interesting torsion problem." Julian let out a theatrical laugh, attracting the attention of Anya and a few other junior architects who were still working. "Oh, listen to this. Our superintendent, a structural engineer. Tell me, Elias, what advanced degrees do you have to critique my work? A certificate in floor waxing?" He strode closer, a predatory glint in his eyes. "Tell you what, why don't you demonstrate for us? Show these young minds how not to approach a complex structural issue. Just a quick demonstration of what happens when untrained eyes meddle with genius." Elias felt a familiar tightening in his chest, a dormant muscle of pride and professional integrity stirring after decades of deliberate suppression. He hadn't forgotten the feeling of public scrutiny, of being forced to perform. He knew what Julian was trying to do. "I don't want to bother you, Mr. Thorne," Elias said, making a move to continue his cleaning rounds. "Just finishing up here, so you can get back to your important work." Julian's smile widened, a cruel twist of triumph. "Everyone, look at this." The old man's afraid to even step up to the table. He probably thinks a load-bearing wall is something you lean your mop against. The few junior architects present laughed nervously, some clearly uncomfortable, but no one dared challenge Julian. Anya watched with a growing knot in her stomach, seeing the raw humiliation being inflicted. What Julian didn't know was that Elias Vance had spent the last 25 years trying to completely forget the name the Shadow Weaver, trying to bury the architect he really was, after an accident that changed his life forever. Julian Thorne, emboldened by the nervous laughter and Elias's apparent reluctance, pressed his advantage. "Come on, man," he sneered, approaching Elias. "Just a little demonstration. I bet you don't even know how to hold a drafting pencil properly. How about showing my students the difference between someone who designs and someone who just cleans the remnants of design?" He gestured dismissively at Elias's cleaning cart. As he spoke, Julian subtly nudged Elias's arm, sending a stack of rolled blueprints tumbling from the cart to the polished floor. It was a seemingly harmless touch, yet it carried all the contempt and arrogance of someone utterly convinced of their own superiority. Elias absorbed the push without moving an inch. His feet remained planted on the ground like old-growth roots, and Julian felt as if he had tried to budge a concrete monolith. The instructor's arrogant smile faltered for a split second. "Interesting," Elias muttered, more to himself than to Julian. "It's been a while since someone tried to provoke me like that." There was something in Elias's voice, not anger, but a frightening calm, the stillness of deep water. It wasn't a threat, but an unsettling declaration that changed the atmosphere in the studio. Julian, unable to interpret the danger signals, doubled down. "Did you hear that, guys? He thinks it's interesting." He mimicked Elias's tone. "How about we show him the difference between thinking and knowing?" What Julian didn't realize was that every humiliating word and gesture was awakening something in Elias that had been dormant for 2 decades. Not anger or a thirst for petty revenge, but something far more dangerous. The crystal-clear memory of who he really was when he stopped hiding. Anya Sharma watched the scene with growing discomfort. There was something about the way the superintendent breathed, the way his shoulders imperceptibly squared. It reminded her of documentaries about ancient craftsmen, of architects from a bygone era whose movements were precise, economical, and deeply informed. The calm before an undeniable display of skill. "Last chance, buddy," Julian announced, now clearly irritated by Elias's lack of a fearful response. "Either you accept the demonstration like a man, or I call security to escort you out. And guess what? You lose your job, too." Elias opened his eyes slowly. When his gaze met Julian's, the young architect felt a chill run down his spine, as if he had just awakened a legend he thought was a harmless myth. "All right," Elias said finally, his voice low but laden with an authority that made everyone present fall silent instantly. "But when we're done, you're going to apologize to all of them for turning this place of learning into a circus of humiliation." Julian laughed, but this time the sound was nervous and forced. "Apologize, man. You're going to be apologizing to the floor when you meet it." What neither of them knew was that Elias had spent the last 25 years not only running from his past, but perfecting an emotional control that had transformed his former destructive perfectionism into something far more refined and devastatingly effective. Each new humiliation only fueled a silent strength within him, a cold determination that his former peers knew well, but that Julian was about to discover in the worst possible way. Elias set his mop bucket down, his movements having a fluid grace that was strange for someone supposedly a mere janitor. Julian adjusted his designer glasses, clearly savoring the sudden, respectful silence that had fallen over the studio. The handful of junior architects formed a semicircle around the central display table, some eager for the demonstration, others visibly uncomfortable. "Everyone, you are about to witness a lesson worth more than 6 months of conventional training," Julian announced theatrically, extending his arms like a showman. The difference between those who dedicate their lives to cutting-edge design and those who just, well, clean the floors where real architects walk. Elias stood motionless in the center of the mat, but something had changed in his breathing. His eyes closed briefly, and for a moment he was no longer in that modern Denver studio. He was back at the groundbreaking ceremony for the Zenith Tower, 25 years ago, hearing similar comments about his unconventional approach before his world-renowned structure was supposed to break ground. Asterisk, look at that young upstart. Someone in the industry had scoffed that distant day. "I bet his organic designs won't last 3 years against a real force of nature." Asterisk Elias had completed the Zenith, an architectural marvel, but its subsequent collapse due to an unforeseen seismic event, killing 3 workers, had cost him dearly. The pressure of the public's praise and subsequent scorn had led him to an almost pathological need for control, a perfectionism that ultimately shattered him. "So, Superintendent," Julian sneered, now circling Elias like a predator, "how about showing my students how not to do a basic structural calculation? Or is that too complicated for someone who only knows how to push a mop?" That's when Anya Sharma couldn't stay silent any longer. The 22-year-old intern, a master's student in sustainable design ethics, had spent the last 2 years documenting cases of overlooked ingenuity and professional prejudice for her thesis. What she was witnessing was valuable academic material, but also deeply disturbing. "Sensei Derek," she interrupted firmly, using a term of respect she often heard, "can I ask you a question? Why exactly do you think it's necessary to humiliate someone who is just doing his job?" The silence that followed was deafening. Julian slowly turned to Anya, his eyes narrowing with a mixture of surprise and irritation. "Excuse me, Anya, but who's teaching class here?" "You are," she replied calmly. "But that shouldn't include professional humiliation disguised as a technical demonstration." Several students exchanged nervous glances. No one had ever confronted Julian like this before. The star architect felt his face flush with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. Humiliation? Julian laughed forcefully. "This has nothing to do with humiliation. It has to do with respect for the architectural profession and knowing your place." Elias opened his eyes slowly. There was something in the way Anya had spoken, in the courage of a young woman standing up to establish authority, that reminded him of his late daughter, Lily. She had had that same determination, that same refusal to accept injustice silently. Lily, a budding environmental activist, had died at 18 in a freak accident during a protest while Elias was in seclusion, grappling with his own guilt over the Zenith Tower collapse. Another person he loved lost while he pursued an almost destructive perfection in design. Another reason to abandon everything and disappear into simplicity of an anonymous life. "Anya," Julian said in a dangerously low voice, "if you can't respect my teaching methods, maybe you should look for another firm. There are places more suited to people with your mentality." The threat hung in the air like toxic smoke. Anya felt a chill run down her spine, but she stood her ground. "My internship is paid, Mr. Thorne, and I believe that everyone here deserves a learning environment based on mutual respect, not humiliation." That's when Elias Vance did something no one expected. He started to smile. It wasn't a nervous or submissive smile. It was a slow, calculated smile of someone who had just found a reason to stop hiding. For 25 years, he had carried the weight of guilt for 2 deaths that had indirectly resulted from his obsessive involvement in the design world. Now, seeing a brave young woman defending principles of justice that he had abandoned decades ago, Elias Vance began to remember who he really was. "Julian," Elias said finally, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made everyone in the room turn to him. "The young lady is right. This isn't about architecture. It's about you trying to feel important by belittling others." Julian spun on his heels, his face red with indignation. "How dare you lecture me about architecture? You don't even know what a structural integrity calculation is." Elias took a step forward, and something fundamental changed in his posture. His shoulders straightened, his center of gravity lowered imperceptibly, and his feet positioned themselves in a stance that any experienced designer would instantly recognize as one of profound engagement and focus. "Actually," Elias said calmly, "I know exactly what structural integrity is, and I know that this place stopped being one that truly values it a long time ago." Julian felt an inexplicable chill run down his spine. There was something about the way Elias moved now, the way he occupied the space, that awakened all of his instincts for self-preservation. But his wounded pride would not allow him to back down. "Enough talk," Julian growled, gesturing dramatically at the complex cantilever problem on the blueprint. "Then show us, old man. Solve this. Show us your design principles instead of just pushing a mop." Anya watched the scene with growing apprehension, but also with professional fascination. She had documented hundreds of hours of design reviews and competitions for her research, and something about the way the superintendent moved reminded her of the great masters she had studied in historical videos. The economy of movement, the controlled breathing, the calm presence that radiated contained power. Elias closed his eyes briefly and allowed 25 years of design memory to resurface. Every technique perfected, every complex problem solved, every lesson learned in the most demanding projects in the world. When he opened them again, Julian was looking directly into the eyes of Elias, the shadow weaver Vance, the legendary architect. Last chance to apologize, Elias offered kindly to Anya, to the students, and to turn this place back into a learning space. Julian laughed, but the sound came out nervous and forced. Apologize, man. You'll be begging for forgiveness when you realize you can't even begin to grasp this problem. What Julian couldn't see was that Elias had already identified all of his design's technical weaknesses. The overly complex cantilevers that created unnecessary stress points. The tendency to prioritize flashy aesthetics over fundamental structural logic. The way he telegraphed his design intentions with micro-movements of his hands across the blueprints. 25 years away from the design table had not erased decades of refined technical analysis. Anya noticed that other students were instinctively backing away, like apprentices sensing an impending shift in the master's focus. Something in the energy of the room had completely changed, as if the air had become charged with a different kind of creative power. It was when everyone laughed at Julian's latest taunts that something unexpected began to take shape in Elias's expression. Not anger or a desire for revenge, but the calm determination of someone who had found a cause worth breaking a 25-year vow of silence for. Some of those present began to realize that something extraordinary was about to happen, even without fully understanding what their eyes were witnessing. Julian assumed his favorite presentation stance, the one he had used to impress hundreds of clients and intimidate beginners over the years. Feet shoulder-width apart, hands gesturing emphatically, weight slightly forward, the classic posture of someone who had learned design in controlled environments against predictable problems. Elias stood motionless for a few seconds, simply observing. His eyes scanned Julian's intricate blueprint from top to bottom, automatically cataloging every technical detail. The overly complex aesthetic that demanded extreme, almost impossible, structural solutions. The unstable base that compromised overall integrity. The excessive reliance on digital simulations that overshadowed fundamental material science. Still waiting, Superintendent? Julian sneered, hopping slightly on his feet. Or are you just going to stand there like a lamppost, admiring my genius? That's when Elias did something no one expected. He started to move. It wasn't a dramatic change, just a subtle repositioning of his feet, a slight lowering of his center of gravity, his shoulders relaxing into a perfectly horizontal line. He'd picked up a simple drafting pencil. But to anyone who knew what to look for, the transformation was instantaneous and frightening. Anya Sharma felt a chill run down her spine. During 2 years studying design biomechanics, she had analyzed hundreds of hours of footage of great architects. What she had just witnessed was a transition from an ordinary man to a born creator, a change as subtle as it was devastating. Interesting, Julian muttered, his confidence wavering for the first time. There was something about the way Elias occupied the space now, the way his hand hovered over the blueprint, that awakened all of his self-preservation instincts. Elias took a step forward, and Julian instinctively backed away. The movement was so involuntary, so primitive, that several students noticed. A star architect backing away from a janitor. The power dynamic of the room had completely shifted. Problem? Elias asked softly, his voice carrying a quiet authority that silenced everyone. Julian felt the blood rush to his cheeks. His reputation was being questioned in front of his own students. He couldn't back down now, even though every fiber of his being was screaming at him to stop and apologize. "No problem," Julian replied, forcing a smile. "Just admiring your pencil grip. Did someone teach you that on YouTube?" The joke fell flat. No one laughed. The tension in the room had become almost palpable. "Actually," Elias said calmly, "I learned it at a place called the School of Form and Structure, and then in the field designing some of the most challenging buildings of my era. Maybe you've heard of it." Julian frowned. The name sounded familiar, but he couldn't place the reference. "School of Form? What kind of weekend boot camp did you do there?" Anya Chun discreetly pulled her phone out of her pocket and quickly typed Elias Vance Architect and School of Form and Structure legendary alumni. What she found made her blood run cold. This wasn't just any prep course. It was where the world's greatest visionary architects of the last 3 decades had truly honed their craft. "Julian," Elias continued, his voice still calm, "last chance. Apologize to Anya for questioning her right to speak. Apologize to your students for turning this place into a circus. And most of all, apologize to yourself for becoming exactly the kind of person that architecture should teach you not to be." The offer of clemency hung in the air like smoke. Julian could have chosen humility. He could have acknowledged that he had crossed a line. He could have preserved what little dignity he had left. Instead, he attacked. He grabbed a marker and, with a flourish, began to furiously sketch an even more complex revision onto the blueprint, attempting to overwhelm Elias with sheer technicality and convoluted lines. It was a desperate attempt to assert his dominance through the very thing he excelled at. Elias simply picked up his pencil. His movement was so fast, so fluid, that half of those present couldn't even process what had happened. He didn't erase Julian's frantic lines. Instead, his pencil danced, adding a single elegant curve, a simple, subtle brace. His body had shifted like water flowing around a rock, and suddenly Julian's chaotic lines looked unnecessary. "Nice try," Elias commented softly, already repositioned and perfectly balanced. "Clean technique in the lines, adequate speed, but you overcomplicated the solution, ignoring the inherent energy flow of the structure." Julian spun wildly, trying to locate the flaw in Elias's single stroke. How had someone simplified his complex design so elegantly? "Beginner's luck," he muttered, more to himself than to Elias. Elias's second attack came in quick succession. He added 3 more lines, each seemingly minimal, yet each one resolving a different tension point in Julian's original cantilever design. It wasn't about erasing Julian's work, but about making it stronger, simpler, more profound. Anya managed to follow the movement. Elias had lowered himself slightly, allowing the jab-like complexity of Julian's design to pass over his head. The straight lines of stress found only air when he leaned back with an impossible curve. And when Julian tried to argue with a flurry of technical terms, Elias took a small step back, causing the verbal assault to pass millimeters from his understanding. Interesting combination of aesthetics and engineering, Elias observed. Still breathing evenly. Works well against static problems, but you're leaving your core structural principles completely exposed. Julian, after Elias's subtle corrections, was starting to sweat. This wasn't normal. He had designed thousands of complex structures in his life, and now He couldn't even make his own design stand up to the scrutiny of a man who had supposedly never designed before. "Stop dancing and design," Julian shouted, launching an even more aggressive sequence of lines, trying to overwhelm the blueprint with his authority. That's when Elias decided the demonstration had gone on long enough. Julian's third attack, a desperate combination of aesthetic flourishes and engineering jargon, found only elegant simplicity once again. But this time, something different happened. When Julian recovered after seeing all his complex elements subtly corrected, Elias was inexplicably closer, his pencil hovering over the blueprint. "How?" Julian whispered, realizing he had completely lost control of the design. "Julian," Elias said softly, now an arm's length away, "do you want to know the difference between someone who learned to design in software and someone who learned from the very earth beneath their feet?" Before Julian could answer, Elias did something that defied everything those present thought they knew about design. Without appearing to use any force, without any sudden or aggressive movements, he simply placed the flat of his hand on the blueprint, specifically on the point where Julian's intricate cantilever met the main structure. Julian's entire complex design for the cantilever seemed to shift. It wasn't pushed or knocked down. It was literally absorbed, rerouted. A single, almost invisible, but perfect curve appeared on the blueprint, drawn by Elias's other hand, simplifying the entire section. The force of the shift was so profound that Julian felt a tremor, as if the entire table, and indeed his entire design, had just been effortlessly transformed. The silence that followed was absolute. Julian stared at the blueprint for a few seconds, trying to process what had happened. There was no pain, just the irresistible force of someone operating on a level completely different from anything he had ever known. "That," Julian muttered, trying to straighten his own design. "That's impossible." Anya Sharma had stopped breathing. In 2 years of studying design, she had never witnessed such a controlled and devastating display of power and understanding. There was no brutality, no anger, just the clinical application of a technique she had only seen in legends. "Actually," Elias said calmly, retracting his hand, "it's quite simple once you understand leverage, timing, and energy transfer. Principles I've learned over a 25-year professional career." Julian ignored the outstretched hand and stood up on his own, his legs still shaking. 25 years professional career and what? Anya answered, her voice almost a whisper. "You don't understand who he is, do you?" Everyone turned to her, who was still holding her cell phone with the results of her search. On the screen, dozens of articles, photos, and videos confirmed what her instincts had already realized. "Elias Vance," she read aloud, "also known as a shadow weaver, visionary architect, considered one of the best technical designers in history, retired undefeated after a 25-year career. Following an accident that resulted in the collapse of the Zenith Tower and the death of 3 construction workers, Elias finished softly, his gaze distant. The impact of the words hit the room like a bomb. Julian felt his face go pale as reality set in. He had challenged a living architectural legend. He had publicly humiliated someone who could have outdesigned him with a casual stroke of a pencil. The shadow weaver," Julian stammered, all his arrogance evaporating instantly. Elias nodded silently. "I retired at 40. Since then, I've been working whatever jobs I can find. Maintenance, simple jobs, simple life. No spotlight, no cameras, no need to prove anything to anyone. The transformation in Julian was instantaneous and painful to watch. The arrogant man was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood the magnitude of his ignorance. I didn't know, Julian whispered. If you had known my name, would you have treated me with respect? Elias interrupted gently, his voice soft but firm. But would you still have humiliated some other maintenance worker? Another junior architect who had no credentials to defend themselves? The question cut deeper than any physical blow. Julian realized that Elias had put his finger on the root of his real problem. Not ignorance about his credentials, but the fundamental arrogance that made him believe he could humiliate people based on their professions or perceived status. Anya stepped forward, her voice firm. Mr. Thorne, for 2 years, I have interned at this firm out of respect for your design experience. But what I witnessed today was not teaching. It was bullying disguised as instruction. Other students began to murmur in agreement. The revelation about Elias had completely changed everyone's perspective on what they had witnessed. Elias, Julian said finally, his voice laden with a humility no one there had ever heard before. I sincerely apologize to you, to Anya, to everyone here. I have no excuse for my behavior. Elias nodded, accepting the apology with the same grace with which he had mastered the design confrontation. Appreciated, Julian, but apologies are only the first step. The question is, what are you going to do differently from now on? Julian looked around the room, seeing his students with new eyes. Some seemed disappointed in his behavior. Others clearly reevaluating everything they thought they knew about respect and hierarchy in the design world. I'll change, Julian promised. It'll take time, but I'll change. I want to learn. That's when Anya asked a question that surprised everyone. Mr. Vance, would you consider teaching again? Because I think we could all learn a lot more from someone who understands that true strength in design comes with responsibility, not just recognition. Elias smiled, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him that night, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Maybe, but not to teach complex design techniques right away. To teach something much more important. That respect isn't earned with awards or titles, but with character. And that the greatest designs are often the simplest, born from humility and a deep understanding of human need and the environment. As Julian fully absorbed the most humiliating lesson of his life, one question hung in the air. Would one night of humility be enough to transform decades of arrogance? Or would an even deeper, more painful change be necessary for true justice to be served? Elias, for his part, felt a lightness he hadn't known in decades. The shadow of guilt still lingered, but a new purpose, a new light, had begun to break through. 3 months later, Ether Design Studios had been subtly, yet profoundly transformed. Elias Vance was no longer just a superintendent. Sarah Chun, having spoken to the firm's senior partners, had convinced them to create a new role, architectural ethics and legacy advisor, with Elias at its helm. He now ran weekly workshops on the principles of conscious design, emphasizing fundamental structural integrity, sustainable practices, and the ethical responsibility of architects. His presence brought a quiet reverence to the studio, and his insights were sought by everyone, from interns to senior designers. Julian Thorne, however, faced a much harsher reality. The discreet video Anya had taken of Elias's demonstration, coupled with a detailed story that quickly spread through the tight-knit architectural community, ruined his reputation. His star client, learning of his arrogance and the structural flaws in his apex design, withdrew their contract. Julian lost half of his remaining projects within the first month. He was eventually let go from Ether, forced to take a position at a smaller, less prestigious firm, starting over with a humility forced by public shame. He had learned the hard way that arrogance comes at a price far greater than any award. Advisor Vance, Anya said after a particularly insightful session on designing with empathy, "Thank you for teaching me that true strength in design doesn't need to be displayed to be recognized. It's built into the very foundation of integrity." Elias smiled, gently organizing a stack of old blueprints. "The best lesson I can teach is simple, Anya. Never judge someone by their profession or appearance. Everyone carries stories and an untold depth of knowledge that can surprise us. And sometimes the most profound solutions are found in the simplest lines." Julian continued teaching at a smaller firm, but now with a forced humility. He spent more time listening, less time boasting. He had begun to sketch again, but with a new emphasis on the core principles Elias had spoken of. He was slowly learning that the true beauty of architecture lay not in its complexity, but in its profound simplicity and ethical purpose. Justice, it turned out, came quietly, like a precisely calculated structural beam that transformed an entire vision without making a sound. Elias Vance had proven that true creative revenge is not destroying your opponent, but showing that greatness comes from character and fundamental understanding, not just titles or awards. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel to discover more stories about how extraordinary people turn humiliation into triumph.